Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of four episodes in our Revolution Untold Lunch and Learn series. My name is Danny Devlin. I'm the Managing Director for Strategic Cultural Partnerships at William and Mary, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today. Before we begin, I want you to know that today's event is being recorded. If you are uncomfortable or otherwise do not consent to being recorded, please allow this to serve as your notice to disconnect from Zoom now, and you can catch the session when we upload it to YouTube later this week. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, of the birth of the United States of America. Revolution Untold uncovers the overlooked stories of the cradle of democracy, of the people that shaped the nation here in Williamsburg, Virginia. Revolution Untold is a public history project seeking to recapture and recenter the untold stories of the American Revolution, moving beyond the familiar cast of founding fathers to explore the lives of people who fought, suffered, resisted, and persisted through one of history's most transformative periods. Six William and Mary students have researched, written, and generated the foundational materials for a series of short-form documentary videos produced by the Williamsburg 250 Commission and designed to bring these overlooked these overlooked stories to the broader public. Revolution Untold is generously sponsored by the Williamsburg 250 Commission, William and Mary Strategic Cultural Partnerships, and the Society of 1918 at William and Mary, and is made possible in part by a grant from the Virginia 250 Commission in partnership. Is made possible in part by a grant from the Virginia 250 Commission in partnership with Virginia Humanities. We have two more entries in the Lunch and Learn series coming up. For more information about these upcoming sessions, visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter at wm.edu/scp. I'm very pleased this afternoon to introduce you to Eira Johnson, class of 2026 history major. Johnson is from Williamsburg, Virginia, a member of the Wesley Foundation and a devotee of the English Country Dance Club and Tolkien Society. Today, Eira is going to take us through the process and product of her research into Clementina Rind. We'll give Eira about 20 minutes to talk you through her research, and then we'll open the virtual floor to your questions and comments. If you would kindly take a moment to make sure you're muted now, and if you have any thoughts that pop up during Eira's presentation, feel free to post them into chat, and I'll be monitoring that during Eira's presentation. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to turn the event over to Eira.
Hello, thank you so much. As Danny said, my name is Eira Johnson. I'm a senior year history student, also working with the NIAD program at William Mary. I'm so glad today to have the chance to tell you about my research for Revolution Untold on the Williamsburg, Virginia printer Clementina Rind. Clementina Rind is probably best known as the first female printer of Virginia and the first woman to hold the public printing contract for the colony. She moved with her husband, William Rind, from Maryland to Williamsburg around 1765 or 1766 when he began his Virginia Gazette. Upon his death in 1773, she assumed sole control of their Virginia Gazette and was swiftly awarded the vacated public printing contract in her own right, rather than just inheriting it from him. I cannot say with any level of certainty what role she played in the business prior to William Rind's death, but she was clearly no novice to the trade, and when she assumed sole control over it, and some of the columns that were already present in his Gazette did grow larger with her, so it might have been she was managing those pieces to begin with. Clementina Rind is demonstrative of the surprising prevalence that can be found of women in trades. Though they do not always appear to follow the same path or traditional path towards a given trade, they appear more frequently than as just solitary outliers and can run these trades quite effectively. Most printers would follow that traditional path of apprenticeship with their master, as many other tradesmen of the era would have. Printers would often transition then into a partnership with their master or just end up working at the press, and such was the path that William Rind took when he was apprenticed to Maryland printer Jonas Green. Many printers could run their trade without a serial publication like a newspaper, but those that did were not generally limited only to the news, and this is particularly important for people with the public printing contract, as they would be printing other documents that were specifically held out to them by the governing body. The holder of the public printing contract was in effect the official printer of the colony and had the exclusive responsibility for official documentation making its way into the hands of the public. And also holding that contract through reputation alone could bring more business through the door just because that's the person with the public printing contract, so they're probably pretty good at what they do. And that was kind of the position Clementina Rind occupied for this year of her life when she was in charge of the Virginia Gazette. Her status as a widow is also particularly important for understanding how she was able to do what she did from the position she occupied in society. Following William Rind's death, she would have made that transition from femme covert back to femme sole. For a married woman, all business transactions, contracts, and exchange of money would have all appeared under her husband's name, which is part of why I can't say for certain what her role would have been in the Gazette prior to his death. She could have been doing things, but it still would have appeared under his name. Though this was the letter of the law, it was not necessarily always the case in reality. For example, like female tavern keepers, oftentimes, even if they're married, will still see their names in contracts and documentations, even though if you're just reading the laws, that shouldn't be possible. However, upon the death of Clementina Rind's husband, she instead would have occupied the position of femme sole in the same status as all unmarried women. She would have been able to make contracts in her own name, purchase property, inherited property, and she had the particular advantages that came to a widow is she had the inherited property, but she also had the disadvantages of a widow of a husband with vast debts and now sole responsibility for taking care of all of her children. Clementina Rind is a figure that I've been familiar with for a little while prior to this internship, just through visits myself to Colonial Williamsburg or opportunities in classes on Williamsburg and learning about her position. I saw through this internship an opportunity to illuminate more of Clementina Rind herself and bring her story to a broader public. Her specific situation being so focused in Williamsburg, sometimes you overlook how she gets there and thus why she had the political leanings she did, what her personal convictions were beyond just the pieces she was publishing. In searching for which niche she filled in the broader story of the American Revolution, of the American story, why she mattered, I found her to be a figure defined by the beginnings of the American Free Press, and through her personal life of its tumultuous religious background, kind of demonstrative to me of the ways Americans were living and thus creating the ideals that would later show up in documents like the Declaration of Independence. Before famous gentry gentlemen put them to pen, people were living them and creating them. They didn't just spawn out of nowhere. Now, before I go any further on Clementina Rind herself, I do want to make a quick clarification when I say Virginia Gazette. Um, there were several Virginia Gazettes throughout the 18th century, and the Rinds were not the first or only ones to use the name. The first printer of the Virginia Gazette was William Park in the 1730s, William Parks in the 1730s. And during Clementina Rind's time, her primary competitors would have been Alexander Purdy and John Dixon and their Virginia Gazette, which was inherited from William Park. A few people in between, but it's the same Gazette. So if at any point after this presentation you feel like looking into Clementina Rind's publication yourself, because they are all available online, just make sure you check who the printer is because they'll be giving business to her competitors. So Clementina Rind started her life in England, born around 1740. So she was an English immigrant to America. She was the daughter of Anglican minister and the curate of Savoy Chapel, John Grierson. She was greatly influenced by her father and his radical tendencies. John Grierson was convicted of performing matrimony without posting banns or having license, which effectively means he performed a marriage without waiting for the permission of the woman in question's father, or either of her parents, really, but the mother was okay with it. Um, his philosophy regarding this sort of falls in line with other burgeoning Protestant denominations of the era. He may have been a follower of the teachings of John Wesley, later founder of Methodism, or another option there is his predecessor at Savoy Chapel also dabbled with some less than legal marriages and had some writings mentioning this might be a good way to make some quick cash when funds were short. So it could have either been a deep religious philosophy regarding the rights of two people or a desire for a little bit more money in his pocket. Either way, he was going against the Church of England for these marriages, and this happened a couple times before he was convicted. In 1755, sorry, he was indicted and set to be transported to the colonies for a period of 14 or 7 years, depending on the record you're looking at. Um, Though convict transportations might bring to mind for most later images of Australia as a penal colony, many convicts were transported to the American colonies as indentured servants throughout the 18th century. Unfortunately, as many did from the harsh conditions, John Grierson took sick and he died before he would ever reach the colony of Maryland. And so the Greyhound, the ship they were transported on, arrived in Annapolis in April of 1755, carrying Clementina Grierson without her father. So already prior to her married life, Clementina Rind came from a legacy of religious conflict in a family that had found itself at odds with the laws of England, with the crown. By the time she arrived to America, she was well acquainted with what to her was a major injustice in the English system. She considered her father deeply wrong and wrote some very poignant letters about it. The next thing we know about her is that sometime before 1762, Clementina Grierson was joined in matrimony with printer William Rind, becoming Clementina Rind. They may have been acquainted through their similar backgrounds. He was also the son of, I believe, a transported convict, though I don't have as much information on him. And Rind had been apprenticed to and later joined in partnership with the printer Jonas Green of Annapolis. The families lived jointly in a household for many years from there, at which time Clementina Rind likely became very close with Anne Catherine Huth Green, who was the wife of Jonas Green. I mentioned that relationship in particular because Anne Catherine Huth Green would have found herself in an identical situation a few years before Clementina Rind did. Her husband passed, and she succeeded him in the Gazette and was the holder of the public printing contract for a brief period of time. Clementina Rind's life in Maryland came to an end in late 1765 when the Rinds moved to Williamsburg, spurred by the desire to start a free and open gazette. Maryland printer Jonas Green had been frequently utilized by the House of Burgesses already at this point for pieces that seemed not fit to the taste of local printers, maybe more radical, more likely to anger Governor Dunmore. Um, Also, William Park, the original printer of the Virginia Gazette, was from Maryland, so there may have also just been an existing relationship between these two colonies for this kind of publication. So William Rind was then invited to Williamsburg to bring his press, and at the behest of the more radical and later revolutionary members of Virginia's political body. Soon after the Rind's Gazette was established in 1766, Rind received the contract for and became the public printer of Virginia, tasked with printing official documentation and messages to Virginia. The family settled very firmly into life in Williamsburg, and many of their children were christened at Bruton Parish Church, including their son, John Grierson Rind. Aside from these happy times, the next most notable upheaval in Clementina Rind's life came with the death of her husband, William Rind, on August 19th of 1773. Though William was praised greatly, even in their rival Gazette, for his devotion to the free press upon his death, he was not so successful as to leave his family without struggle. Rind's death left Clementina to deal with vast debts while supporting their, I believe at this time, 5 children. All of his belongings were put to sale to cover these debts, and the home they lived in was also at one point listed to be sold by their landlord in the following months. As a mother to dependent children set without an income, Clementina Rind wasted little time in assuming control of the business. She printed her first edition of the Gazette only a few days later on September 2nd. She purchased the printing press from before it was sold on 6 months of credit, and then later was able to purchase more goods and keep the press with a loan she procured from the then mayor of Williamsburg, John Blair, as well as a few other gentlemen, which I want to highlight because to me, these records kind of establish how deeply embedded she already was in the community and how trusted she was by pillars of Williamsburg society. As she ran the press like William before her, it's important to note that despite heading it like William, she was not running it alone. She had been aided by a household member we believe was related to William Rind named John Pinckney. And the household also included an enslaved man named Dick, who likely worked as a semi-skilled artisan with the Gazette. Unfortunately, there appears thus far very few records of Dick to illuminate his life before or after Clementina Rind's death, so I can't say much detail on his situation, but he was definitely a member of the household and he was definitely involved in the printing of the Gazette. Clementina Rind's Gazette under her tenure is perhaps best characterized by the same heading that appeared on her husband's Gazette and would continue through every edition of the Gazette: open to all parties, but influenced by none. Under Clementina Rind's lead, the press printed such publications as Thomas Jefferson's A Summary Rights of the View of British America, which is largely considered to be the precursor to the Declaration of Independence, as it articulated some of the same ideas and used similar language in places. The House of Burgesses was also notoriously dismissed by Governor Dunmore after they passed a resolution for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer in solidarity with the people of Boston after the closing of the port with the Boston Tea Party. And this announcement was also published by Clementina Rind. So she had printed a few things to draw the ire of Governor Dunmore in allegiance with these more radical members of the Virginia political body. One of her most important contributions as a printer was this belief in the freedom of the press. For all of aforementioned patriotic missives she was engaged in printing, she also included several other perspectives, partially just because of her role as the public printer, but also partially indicative of her views that all these views needed to be shown. Is she printed many things by Governor Dunmore. He was more popular in the years before the Revolution, so it wasn't radical to be printing things by Jefferson and Dunmore at the same time. But she was still kind of including opposing parties in her Gazette without much judgment. Um, Another sign of her continued views and shaping of the news is the way she printed several religious documents in her Gazette. There was one by the Society of Friends and a few other just notes in her Gazette that were not just purely a good Anglican's prayers, but some other denominations that would not have been so accepted in the time. Her husband's earlier apprentice was also a Quaker, so there's some evidence to suggest that the household was more open in differing religious perspectives than most people would have been in the time. Though it kept with the principles with which it was founded, Clementina's Gazette noticeably diverged from her husband's in style. One thing is she just bought a new set of types, so that changed the print completely. But it also included more poetic notes. She included acrostics in her Gazette, some of which were already present, but they grew much larger under her guidance. More local poets were writing. There were some columns devoted to female readership. Despite her successes, Clementina Rind would only helm the Virginia Gazette for about 13 months, because she died on September 25th of 1774 after a brief and trifling illness, is what the Gazette said. She was given much praise after her death. There were constant write-ins, constant letters being published about what an amazing person she was, and poems. One I particularly enjoyed was from a constant reader who declared, "Shall Clementina Rind's praises remain unsung?" Which they very much would not, because so many people were writing in about what a wonderful printer she was. Both on account of her sex and her early death, Clementina Rind's contributions in the lead up to the American Revolution are easy to miss. Much of what she's noted for being involved with is elevating the voice of others through publication in her press, which can muddle the waters of her actual beliefs and personal ideals. All the same, she very clearly played a very important role in her spread of patriotic thought in Virginia, spreading stories of others within something she wrote herself. It's interesting to wonder what might have happened if, after William Rind's death, a less free-minded Gazette had taken over, if she hadn't been awarded that public printing contract, if Dixon and Purdy had instead gotten it. The feelings of people in Williamsburg might have been slightly different, guided by a different Gazette. For most of my research, I was trying to just establish a sketch of who Clementina Rind was, beyond the big things, beyond just a couple of the things she printed. How'd she get where she was? What were her political leanings? What was her background? Mostly I was able to do that through looking at what she chose to publish. She's being paid to publish things, but she still made some very strong choices. For example, she chose not to print several things. She was lambasted by competitors for not printing anonymous pieces. She said if it was a scandal, she wouldn't print it without having the name of the person, because then it's just libel. Interestingly enough, though, something that didn't make it into my script is that she broke that rule a few times for things she was personally annoyed with. As a William Mary student, I found it very interesting that there's this notorious back and forth with faculty of the College of William and Mary and an anonymous man known as Academicus, talking about just how rowdy and irresponsible and disreputable that whole school is. And all of that's published in her Gazette, which doesn't quite align with her stated views, but I imagine that sort of implies she might have been a little annoyed with the college boys next door as well. For the places where I couldn't find records of her, as I said, most of her documents, we have a wealth of documents for Clementina Rind. I'm very fortunate in that for my research, but we don't have many personal documents for Clementina Rind. I mentioned a letter earlier, but we have no letters from her life as well Clementina Rind prior to her marriage. So instead, what I was able to do was look at other figures who had similar backgrounds and see what was going on in their lives, see how they handled these transitions to sort of fill in the gaps in her story. The biggest thing I had, though, and the most important thing in establishing her story was looking at the existing scholarship and secondary sources and seeing where they overlapped and where the missing gaps were. The most notable scholar I know of for Clementina Rind is Martha J. King, who's written many wonderful pieces. But most of her work, when you look up Clementina Rind, you'll often find born around 1740 in Maryland. They don't know where she's from. They're just kind of assuming that. And I was able to find records from the former Maryland state archivist who believed she was Clementina Grierson and talking about his research there. And so I was able to follow those threads and use some sources for her later life and then find these disparate pieces and sew together what happened in between based on these other stories. When it came to actually writing her script, I struggled a bit with, I don't know, writing over her. Clementina Rind is a figure who we have a lot of her voice left. Her Gazette printed other people's pieces, but she appears frequently in it, her own writings, her own poetic notes. She talks to her audience, mostly telling them to pay her because they have a lot of debts and they're not paying quickly. So I tried to imagine how she would write to people wanting to tell her own story. She's a woman who writes in her own voice frequently, but also as a Gazette writer, I thought she'd be used to telling the story in the third person, telling it like it's someone else. And so I was interested in fiddling with that as I tell the story of how she fits into the American story. Her primary goal in the Gazette is to make it interesting, is to make people have fun. Another proof of how successful she was is after her death. Don't know why he chose to publish these, but her successor, John Pinckney, has a series of letters published of a man who keeps writing to him and telling him what a terrible Gazette his is because it's not half as interesting as Mrs. Rind's work. He said, "You tell the news, but it's not fun." Versus Mrs. Rind's was quite fun. So in general, it's just finding how she would have written her own voice, how she would have presented herself to the public in the now and then, because they are very similar stories. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about my research on Clementina Rind and giving me the opportunity to tell you about where she fits in the American story and her role in all of this. Thank you so much for your time, and let me know if you have any questions.
It's great, Eira. Thank you very much. I'd like to open it now to questions from the assembled audience here. If you want to just go ahead and unmute yourself and put yourself on video for your questions, that would be terrific. And to start us off, I have one for you, Eira. As you've been digging into Rind's story, what has surprised you or challenged the assumptions you've had with past historical research you've been involved in? And how is this shaping the way you think about whose voices get carried forward in the historical record?
One thing for certain is going on a deep dive in an individual, it really challenges the way I think about people with how human they were in this story. Clementina Rind in particular, we think of these patriotic revolutionary voices. Like Clementina Rind's Gazette was started to have a gazette that wasn't in the pocket of the British, of Governor Dunmore. And yet, if you read her Gazette, she praises the king several times. She seems very patriotic for England. What you see in this kind of period of 1773 to 74 is these gradual murmurings of anti-parliamentary talk. Reading about Clementina Rind has sort of forced me to reestablish what I envision as a patriot. It wasn't just this sudden rise of we're American, we're not British. It was this slow breaking of a relationship and these continued connections. Even Clementina Rind, whose father was convicted by England, who died because of an English justice system, was incredibly devoted and for a time loyal to that nation across the sea. It also makes me think of In terms of whose stories get carried forwards, what we actually know about what we know, if that makes sense. Because Clementina Rind was always presenting herself for a public. Everything she wrote was being consumed by the masses. So when I talk about her views and her political leanings, it's made me pause and step back and wonder, do we actually know this? Because if these people, especially even gentry figures like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, these big documents they wrote, they're writing them for people. These aren't personal missives. So it's made me reevaluate when we're carrying forward voices. Do we actually know whose voices we're carrying forwards? What's the internal monologue? What's the world around them?
It's a great answer, Eira. It's the basic problem of history, isn't it? How do we know what we think we know? Thank all of you for joining us for our second Revolution Untold Lunch and Learn event. Our next session will be investigating James Armistead Lafayette with William and Mary student Lorenzo Short. You can scan the QR code on your screen or go to the registration page now, or join our mailing list for updates and reminders by visiting us on the web at wm.edu/scp. I want to say once again that we're extremely grateful to our sponsors, the Williamsburg 250 Commission, the Society of 1918, and the Virginia 250 Commission and Virginia Humanities, and of course, donors to Strategic Cultural Partnership, whose generous support has made this research possible. By sharing these stories, we remember more fully, understand more clearly, and expand the story of the American Revolution. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.